Luca stood still, his small hands clutching the red toy car, the last gift from his mother, Elena. His eyes were red, glistening with unshed tears, but he did not cry. Not yet. Aunt Rosa placed a hand on his shoulder, her voice choked with emotion. "Go on, dear, say goodbye to your mother one last time." Luca nodded, but each step felt unbearably heavy, as if his heart was pulling him back. Marco, Elena's brother, stood nearby, his hands clenched tightly together, trying to suppress the grief constricting his chest. He looked at Luca, his heart aching. The little boy, only 5 years old, was facing the greatest loss of his life. The crowd remained silent, their eyes filled with sorrow as they watched the small child approach the coffin. Luca stood on his toes, his trembling hands reaching out to touch the cold hand of the woman lying there. His face suddenly froze, his eyes widening in shock. The toy car slipped from his grasp, shattering against the floor with a sharp crack. "That's not my mother." Luca's voice rang out, clear yet quivering, tearing through the silence like a blade. He staggered backward and collapsed onto the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. Marco rushed forward, kneeling down to hold Luca, his voice urgent and desperate. "Luca, calm down, that's your mother." But the boy struggled fiercely, crying between gasping breaths, "No. Mom had a scar on her hand. She told me. That person doesn't have one." Marco froze, his breathing quick and uneven. His hands trembled as he reached into the coffin, flipping over the woman's hand. No scar. His chest tightened, and a mixture of doubt and rising fury surged through him. He spun around, his voice thunderous as he shouted at the funeral director, "Stop! Stop everything right now!" Luca remained on the ground, his face buried in his hands as he sobbed, his voice weak and broken. "Where's Mom, Uncle Marco?" Marco clenched his fists, his eyes burning red. He had no answer. If this woman wasn't Elena, then where was his sister? The unbearable truth had just surfaced, dragging them both into a storm of fear and uncertainty. Marco stood frozen before the coffin, his hands still trembling after realizing the horrifying truth. Luca curled up on the floor, his sobs like daggers piercing deep into Marco's heart. "Where's Mom, Uncle Marco?" Luca's weak, confused voice broke through the silence. Marco turned, knelt down, and held the boy tightly, trying to suppress the rising tide of fear and anger. "I will find her, Luca. I swear," he whispered, his voice hoarse, his eyes burning with determination. He stood up, took Luca's hand, and strode straight toward Mr. Thomas, the family lawyer, who stood hesitantly among the crowd. "Elena's will read it again," Marco commanded, his voice cold and sharp. Mr. Thomas flipped through the papers in his hands, sweat beading on his forehead. "She left everything to Andrew, her business partner," he said hesitantly. Marco clenched his teeth, his fists tightening. "Andrew? There's no way Elena would do that. It's forged, I know it," he roared, his suspicions now turning into pure rage. Marco didn't wait. He immediately called Daniel, a private investigator who had helped him in the past. Daniel arrived within an hour, his sharp eyes scanning Luca, now sitting still on a chair, clutching the broken pieces of his toy car. "Tell me everything," Daniel said, his voice calm but firm. Marco recounted everything, from Luca's terrified scream to the scarless hand in the coffin. He slammed his fist on the table, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "If Elena is alive, she's in danger. I need to bring her back to Luca." Daniel nodded, scribbling rapidly in his notebook. "We need to exhume the body, confirm the identity. And Andrew, he's the key." Marco nodded firmly, his heart aching but a flicker of hope igniting within him at the thought that Elena might still be alive. That night, Marco and Daniel broke into an old house that Daniel suspected belonged to Andrew, registered under a false name. Marco took the lead, heart pounding, gripping his flashlight tightly. "Elena!" he called softly, his voice trembling. Daniel signaled for silence, pointing toward the basement. They broke the lock and descended the dark staircase. In the corner of the room, Marco saw a frail figure, hair disheveled. "Elena!" he shouted, rushing forward. It was her, alive but weak, her sunken eyes staring at him in fear. She grabbed Marco's hand, her voice barely a whisper. "Andrew, he wants everything. He locked me up." Marco pulled her into a tight embrace, tears streaming down his face, anger and relief crashing over him at once. "You're alive. Luca needs you," he choked out. Daniel stood behind them, his expression grim. "We need to get her out. Now. Andrew won't stop." Marco nodded, helping Elena to her feet. At that moment, only one thought consumed him: protecting his sister and nephew, no matter what it took. Marco helped Elena out of the basement, his grip on her shoulders tight, as if afraid she would disappear again. Elena trembled, her voice weak. "Luca, how is my son?" Marco choked up, tears rolling down his face. "He's been waiting for you every day. Now that you're back, everything will be okay." Daniel followed behind, his eyes sharp as he spoke into his phone, contacting the police. "Andrew will find out soon that Elena is alive. He'll get desperate," Daniel warned, his voice low but tense. Marco nodded, holding Elena even closer, his rage burning inside him. They took Elena to the hospital that very night. Luca was called in, and the moment he ran into the room and saw his mother lying on the bed, he burst into tears, throwing himself into her arms. "Mom! I knew you weren't gone." Luca sobbed, his tiny hands clinging tightly to her. Elena smiled weakly, tears streaming down her face. "I'm here, my love. I'll never leave you again." Marco stood nearby, relieved but still heavy-hearted. They weren't safe as long as Andrew was free. The next morning, Andrew arrived at the hospital, his face feigning concern. "I heard Elena was found. I'm so relieved," he said, his voice sweet, but his eyes flickered with danger. Marco stepped forward, blocking his path, fists clenched. "Relieved? You locked up my sister, faked her death to steal everything from her," he growled, his voice shaking with fury. Andrew smirked coldly, his voice chillingly calm. "You have no proof, Marco. Who would believe you?" But Daniel stepped up, raising a thick folder: fake wills, photos of Elena's captivity, and Andrew's financial records. "We have everything, Andrew." "It's over for you," Daniel said, his voice steady and sharp. Andrew's face turned pale as he thrashed and screamed. "I have money, power. You can't touch me." Marco lunged forward, ready to punch him, but two police officers suddenly appeared, handcuffing Andrew. "Andrew Carter, you're under arrest for kidnapping and fraud," one officer declared. Andrew howled in rage as he was dragged away, his eyes burning with hatred. On the day of the trial, Elena sat in court, holding Luca's hand tightly, her voice trembling as she recounted the days of her captivity. Marco sat behind her, his eyes red, feeling both proud and heartbroken watching his sister fight her final battle. Andrew was sentenced to life in prison. His face turned ghostly white, his arrogance completely shattered. After the trial, Elena embraced Luca and Marco, tears falling freely. "Thank you, Marco. You gave me a second chance at life." Marco smiled, placing a hand on her shoulder. "We're family, Elena. I would never leave you. As time passed, Elena reclaimed her company, erasing all traces of Andrew. One afternoon, they sat together in the yard, watching Luca play with his new toy car, his laughter echoing through the air. Elena turned to Marco, her voice warm. "We made it through, didn't we?" Marco nodded, his eyes shining. "We did. And from now on, nothing will tear us apart." Luca ran over, wrapping his arms around both of them. "I love you, Mom. I love you, Uncle." His words were like light, chasing away all the shadows of the past.